Hello, my dear friend. Welcome back to Books and More, where we gently distill the essence of great literature, allowing you to grasp the core values of profound works while saving your precious time. In the relentless rush of our daily lives, it is all too easy to become swept away by the noise, forgetting to pause and truly understand the world around us, and perhaps the world within us. We all seek a way to live more mindfully, with greater clarity and purpose. Today, I invite you to step into the fascinating and revealing world of Boomerang by Michael Lewis. This is not merely a dry account of financial collapse. It is a gripping travelogue through the wreckage of national economies, exploring the unique human behaviors that drive global chaos. Lewis takes us on a journey to nations that were blinded by easy credit, showing us how different societies react when the lights go out and they are left alone with their impulses. It makes us ask ourselves, what truly reveals a nation's character when the facade of wealth is stripped away? And deeper still, how do our own cultural instincts shape our destiny when we are faced with unlimited temptation? As we explore these stories, remember that understanding the flaws of the world often helps us navigate our own paths with more compassion and wisdom. You are not alone in this search for meaning. We are walking this path of discovery together. I wish you a peaceful and enlightening experience as we open these pages. Let us begin this journey now. The Greatest Trade. The idea for this journey began by accident while I was working on a previous book about the Wall Street collapse. I became fascinated by a small group of investors who had made fortunes by betting against the subprime mortgage market. These men had sat alone in a boat watching the Titanic sink while the band played on. One of them was a man named Kyle Bass, who ran a hedge fund in Dallas. Unlike the others who took their winnings and retreated, Bass was already looking for the next disaster. He believed the financial crisis was far from over and that it had merely shifted from the private sector to the public sector. Governments had absorbed the bad debts of banks, and now sovereign nations themselves were on the hook. When I visited Bass in Dallas, he laid out a terrifying theory. He and his team had gathered data that no one else seemed to have bothered to collect. They looked at the size of banking systems relative to the tax revenues of their host countries. The numbers were staggering. Ireland, for instance, had accumulated banking debts utterly disproportionate to its ability to pay. When Bass showed these figures to a leading economist at Harvard, the man was stunned. The conclusion was simple and frightening. This accumulation of debt had never happened before in history. As interest rates eventually rose, these countries would not be able to pay their bills. They would default. Bass did not just sit on this information, he acted on it. He bought credit default swaps on the debt of countries like Greece, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. At the time, these bets were incredibly cheap because the financial world simply did not believe that developed Western nations could go bust. It was a scenario that had never happened in modern times, but Bass was convinced. He told me that once confidence is lost, it is gone forever. Listening to him was a disorienting experience. On one hand, his logic was impeccable. On the other, he seemed like a man preparing for the apocalypse. He advised buying physical gold and guns. He showed me a photo of 20 million nickels he had purchased and stored in a vault, simply because the metal in them was worth more than their face value. We drove around his ranch in a Hummer equipped with military gadgets, shooting at beavers that threatened his water supply. He was a character straight out of fiction, yet his financial instincts had been dead right before. I asked him how a money manager in Texas, who rarely traveled, developed such specific theories about distant lands. His answer was surprising. He credited the board game Risk. As a child, he learned that if you controlled Iceland, you could attack anyone. That childhood lesson made him pay attention when Iceland suddenly became a global banking powerhouse. His fixation on that tiny island nation convinced me to pack my bags. If the collapse of the global economy was going to start with the bankruptcy of a nation, I wanted to see the place that Bass believed was the key to ruling the world. Wall Street on the Tundra. I landed in Reykjavik just after the entire country had effectively gone bankrupt in October 2008. The situation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. An official from the International Monetary Fund told me that Iceland was no longer a country, but rather a hedge fund that had crashed. This was a place where a population the size of Peoria, Illinois, had suddenly decided to stop fishing and start running global investment banks. In the span of a few years, 3 Icelandic banks had amassed assets worth nearly 10 times the entire nation's economy. The locals had borrowed billions in foreign currencies to buy assets they had no business owning, from British soccer teams to Danish department stores. When the global credit crunch hit, the party ended instantly, leaving every man, woman, and child in Iceland creating a burden of debt that was mathematically impossible to repay. My journey into this frozen disaster zone was surreal from the start. I stayed at the 101 Hotel, a trendy spot owned by the wife of a failed anchor, where the staff drifted around in black like undertakers. The city felt shell-shocked. I met people who were still trying to process how they went from being sensible fishermen to masters of the universe and back to nothing. One young currency trader told me how he had stuffed cash into a chessboard to hide it from a hypothetical foreign invasion. He explained that people were buying expensive Range Rovers with cheap loans denominated in Japanese yen, and when the Icelandic krona collapsed, the cost of those loans exploded. The only way out for many was to set their cars on fire to collect the insurance money. As I sat in my hotel room, I could almost hear the distant booms of luxury vehicles exploding across the city. I wanted to understand how a culture so rooted in survival and hard work had lost its mind so completely. The answer seemed to lie in their history with fish. Decades ago, Iceland privatized its fishing grounds, giving individual fishermen quotas that they could trade or borrow against. This turned fish into financial assets and fishermen into tycoons. It taught them they could make money by trading paper rather than battling the elements. They applied the same logic to banking. They believed their natural instincts as hunters made them superior financiers. They thought they could spot opportunities others missed and move faster than the lumbering giants of Wall Street. They were wrong. They were just buying bad assets at inflated prices because no one else wanted them. The arrogance was staggering. I learned about an American economist named Bob Aliber who had visited Reykjavik before the crash. He had looked at the number of construction cranes and the prices of apartments and realized it was a perfect bubble. He warned them that their banks were dead and that they should sell everything immediately. The Icelanders laughed at him. They dismissed warnings from Danish analysts as mere jealousy. The president of Iceland had even traveled the world giving speeches about how the Icelandic character made them naturally gifted at banking, claiming their lack of regulation was a feature, not a bug. They truly believed they had reinvented finance. When I visited the Prime Minister, Geir Hard, he seemed completely detached from reality. He sat in his office while crowds of angry citizens protested outside, banging drums and demanding answers. He insisted that the problem wasn't Iceland's reckless borrowing, but rather the failure of Lehman Brothers in the United States. He tried to tell me that they had been prudent, even as the evidence of their insanity was burning in the streets. It was clear that the government had no idea what the bankers had been doing. They had let a few dozen men leverage the entire country's future on a gamble they didn't understand. That was another striking feature of this catastrophe. It was almost entirely a male production. There were hardly any women in the upper echelons of Icelandic finance. I spoke to one of the few women who had been in banking, and she told me she quit because the culture was pure testosterone. It was a herd of men competing to see who could take the biggest risks. Now that the money was gone, the women were the ones left to clean up the mess, stepping in to run the government and the remnants of the banks. I spent my last days in Iceland trying to reconcile the stark beauty of the volcanic landscape with the ugly financial ruin. I visited the Alcoa aluminum plant, where I learned that construction had been delayed to certify that no elves or hidden people lived on the building site. It summed up the country perfectly. This was a place where modern industrial ambition coexisted with ancient superstitions. They had convinced themselves that the normal rules of economics didn't apply to them, just as they believed in elves living in the rocks. They had stepped out of their fishing boats and into Ferraris, assuming the ride would never end. But in the end, they were just a small island in the middle of nowhere that had mistaken debt for wealth. They had borrowed the future to have a party in the present, and now the bill had arrived. And they invented math. I traveled to the Varopadi monastery on Mount Athos because I wanted to find the spiritual center of a financial collapse. This remote peninsula in northern Greece is difficult to reach, requiring a flight, a long drive, and a boat ride, effectively cutting it off from the modern world. Women have been banned here for 1,000 years. I told the monk at the gate I was there for a pilgrimage, which was technically true, though I was worshiping at the altar of high finance rather than religion. I had come to see the men who had allegedly brought down the Greek government. The situation in Athens was catastrophic. The country had essentially stopped functioning as a modern economy. I met with the finance minister, a man who looked far too decent for the mess he had inherited. He explains that upon taking office, his team discovered the national deficit was not the 3% that previous government had claimed. It was closer to 14%. The books had been cooked so thoroughly that they had simply stopped counting billions of dollars in expenses. It was not just a mistake. It was a systematic lie designed to keep the money flowing. I learned that this deception went all the way to the bottom of society. I spent time with tax collectors who were terrified of being seen with me. They described a national culture where tax evasion was not a crime, but a way of life. The majority of doctors, lawyers, and self-employed professionals in wealthy suburbs declared an income below 12,000 euros a year to avoid paying taxes. I heard stories of plastic surgeons who claimed to be destitute while living in villas. The tax system had collapsed because there was absolutely no trust between the people and the state. The government assumed everyone was lying, and the people assumed the government was stealing, so everyone stole what they could. It was a society where the rules were optional. I saw this everywhere I looked. The National Railroad had become a massive patronage scheme where the average salary was 65,000 euros a year, and the total revenue from ticket sales barely covered a fraction of the payroll. It would have been cheaper for the government to put every single rail passenger in a taxi cab. The public sector had doubled in size, funded by cheap credit that became available once Greece joined the euro. Investment banks like Goldman Sachs had even helped the government hide its true debt levels with complex financial derivatives, effectively mortgaging the country's future revenue streams just to keep the lights on today. This total moral collapse brought me back to the monks. The Varopadi monastery had become the focus of public rage because they had played the game better than anyone else. Father Ephraim and his right-hand man, Father Arsenios, were not just spiritual leaders. They were aggressive, brilliant CEOs. They had discovered ancient imperial bulls giving them ownership of a lake that was essentially a worthless nature reserve. Through a mix of spiritual intimidation and shrewd negotiation, they convinced the government to swap this useless lake for 73 prime commercial properties in Athens, including the Olympic Gymnastics Center. They had turned a piece of water into a billion-dollar real estate empire. When the deal was exposed, the government fell, and the monks became symbols of the corruption that had destroyed the country. I sat down with Father Asinios in his modern office within the ancient walls. He served me pastries and explained their philosophy. He told me that the smart man accepts while the stupid man insists. He did not seem to feel any guilt. In his eyes, they were simply maximizing the assets of the church for the glory of God. They were efficient, disciplined, and wildly successful in a country that was none of those things. As I watched the monks praying in their church at dawn, surrounded by the wealth they had accumulated, I realized that the financial crisis in Greece was not really about money. It was about a total breakdown of civic behavior. The monks were just a mirror reflecting the society around them. Everyone in Greece had been raiding the till, from the politicians to the tax-dodging doctors. The monks just happened to be the most talented players in a game where the only rule was to take what you could before the money ran out. When Ireland ate the forbidden fruit. When I landed in Dublin in November 2010, the Irish government was busy trying to get its citizens accustomed to the scale of their loss. It had been 2 years since a small group of politicians and bankers decided to guarantee the debts of the nation's biggest banks, and now the bill was coming due. The numbers were staggering. Just one bank, Anglo-Irish, had lost 34 billion euros. To understand what that number sounds like to an Irish ear, you have to multiply it by nearly 100 to get the American equivalent. It was roughly $3.4 trillion, and that was just one bank. The total losses were so large that they had effectively bankrupted the country. The catastrophe had similarities to what I saw in Iceland, but with a distinct flavor. In Iceland, men had ignored their wives and bought foreign assets. In Ireland, they used foreign money to buy Ireland. They bought it from each other. The incredible economic boom that preceded the crash had transformed the country from one of the poorest in Europe to one of the richest. For centuries, the Irish solution to economic trouble was emigration. Suddenly, people were flowing in. But the prosperity was built on a foundation of sand. The entire nation had engaged in a massive real estate bubble. I wanted to understand how a country with such a history of hardship had lost its mind so completely. I found that the Irish banks had not really engaged in the complex, subprime trickery of Wall Street. Their folly was much old-fashioned. They simply lent money to property developers to buy land and build things that no one needed. The newly formed National Asset Management Agency was now sitting on mountains of bad loans. I heard stories of developers who had personally guaranteed hundreds of millions in loans, men who were now ruined, but strangely, mostly not in hiding. The turning point was the night of September 29, 2008. As Lehman Brothers collapsed and fear gripped the global markets, the Irish government made a fateful decision to issue a blanket guarantee for the liabilities of its banks. They did this based on the advice of local bankers and a hasty report from Merrill Lynch, which assured them that the banks were fundamentally sound and just facing a liquidity problem. It was a lie, or at least a massive delusion. The banks were insolvent. By guaranteeing them, the government lashed the sinking ships to the state, dragging the entire country down with them. There was one man who had seen it coming. Morgan Kelly, a professor of economics at University College Dublin, had looked at the data years earlier and realized the math simply did not work. House prices had risen 500%, while rents had fallen. He predicted that prices would crash and that the banks, which were heavily exposed to property, would be wiped out. For his trouble, he was ridiculed by the political establishment. The prime minister at the time, Bertie Ahern, had famously wondered why the people complaining about the economy didn't just commit suicide. Now, Kelly was looked upon as a prophet, though he seemed to take no pleasure in being right. I spent time driving around the countryside to see the physical evidence of this mania. My driver took me to what were called ghost estates. We saw half-finished villages in the middle of nowhere, houses with grass growing through the floorboards, and hotels that were abandoned before they ever opened. It was a landscape of desolation. We visited a site in a remote village where a small developer named Joe McNamara had tried to build a massive luxury hotel. It was just a giant hole in the ground now. McNamara later drove a cement mixer into the gates of the Irish Parliament in protest, but he was an exception. What struck me most was the silence. In Greece, the people were rioting in the streets, blaming everyone but themselves. In Ireland, there was a strange, stoic acceptance. The anger was turned inward. I think this was because the Irish knew that, unlike the Greeks who had been failed by their government, the Irish people had done this to themselves. They had all bought the houses. They had all accepted the cheap credit. They felt complicit. I managed to find one man who had publicly expressed his rage. Gary Keogh, an elderly, mild-mannered man, had gone to a shareholder meeting of the Allied Irish banks and thrown rotten eggs at the executives. He told me he practiced his aim for weeks. He was disgusted by the arrogance of the bankers who had destroyed the country's wealth and refused to apologize. But Gary was a rare case. Most people I met were just quietly devastated. The political class seemed equally paralyzed. I met with Brian Lenihan, the finance minister who had signed the guarantee. He was a tragic figure, battling pancreatic cancer while trying to manage the collapse of his nation. He insisted to me that Ireland was not Iceland, that they had liquidity, but the markets said otherwise. The country was running out of cash. The European Central Bank and the IMF were already dictating terms. Ireland had lost its sovereignty, not to an invading army, but to its own financial recklessness. Ultimately, the Irish crash was a story about a close-knit society that trusted its own members too much. They believed their local bankers when they said everything was fine. They believed their politicians who said the boom would last forever. They were a tribe that had finally found a pot of gold, and in their desperation to keep it, they believed the lies they told each other until the very end. Now, the young people were leaving again, emigrating just as their ancestors had, leaving behind a country full of empty houses and a mountain of debt that would take generations to repay. The Secret Life of Germans. I arrived in Hamburg in the summer of 2011 when the fate of the global economy seemed to rest entirely in the hands of the German people. The credit ratings of countries like Portugal and Ireland were collapsing, and Greece had officially become the least creditworthy nation on Earth. Because Germany was the largest creditor to these failing states and the only hope for future loans, the Germans had become the moral arbiters of Europe. They were angry. They felt they had been tricked by the lying Greeks and swindled by American investment bankers. They saw themselves as the prudent, hard-working victims of a world gone mad with debt. But as I traveled through the country, I began to suspect that the story was not quite that simple. To understand why German banks had behaved so strangely, I found myself turning not to an economist, but to a folklorist named Alan Dundas. Dundas had written a small book in the 1980s that argued the German national character was defined by a specific obsession with cleanliness and order on the outside and a fascination with filth on the inside. He documented how German culture is filled with scatological references, from the casual language of the people to the writings of Martin Luther and Mozart. He noted a peculiar attraction to things that other cultures might find repulsive, provided there was a barrier of order protecting the observer. In Hamburg, I found a living metaphor for this in the Reeperbahn red light district. There was a tradition of mud wrestling where women fought in slime, while the men watching wore plastic shower caps to keep themselves spotless. It was the perfect image for the German financial crisis. They wanted to be close to the filth of the subprime market to get the yield, but they wanted to believe they could stay clean while doing it. This cultural duality explained the catastrophe of the German banks. Unlike the Americans who created the subprime toxic assets, or the Irish who went mad borrowing money to build houses for themselves, the Germans had done something unique. They had taken their own hard-earned savings and sent them abroad to fund the madness of others. German bankers, particularly those at state-backed institutions like the Landesbanks and IKB in Dusseldorf, had been the biggest buyers of Wall Street's subprime garbage. They had gone to New York and London and eagerly purchased bonds that even the most reckless American speculators were trying to offload. Wall Street traders told me that when they had a product so toxic no one else would touch it, they knew they could always sell it to the stupid Germans in Dusseldorf. I spoke with Dirk Rothig, a former executive at IKB, who described a banking culture that was blind to reality. He had tried to warn his superiors that the American housing market was turning, that the risks were too high for the returns. They ignored him. They treated the subprime bonds like free money. The problem was that the Germans trusted the rules too much. If a rating agency stamped a bond with a AAA rating, the German banker believed it was safe. They did not look inside the box. They focused on the formal criteria, checking off lines on a spreadsheet, convinced that if the paperwork was in order, the investment must be sound. It was a failure of common sense driven by a blind faith in systems and rules. They had been seduced by the appearance of safety and the promise of yield, unaware that they were the ones keeping the global Ponzi scheme alive in its final hours. In Berlin, I went to the Ministry of Finance to meet with Jörg Asmussen, a key government official managing the crisis. The building itself was intimidating, a massive stone structure from the Nazi era that radiated power and cold authority. Asmussen was the picture of German efficiency, fit and disciplined, sitting in an office where every paper was perfectly aligned. He expressed the official German view that the Greeks and other Southern Europeans needed to change their culture. They needed to become more like Germans. There was no acknowledgement that German banks had been complicit in lending the money that fueled the bubbles in Greece, Ireland, and Spain. The narrative was strictly one of German virtue and foreign vice. Yet underneath this stern exterior, there was a sense of entrapment. Germany had benefited immensely from the euro, which kept their currency artificially low and boosted their exports. Now they were on the hook. They had to bail out their neighbors not just to save Europe, but to save their own banks, which were stuffed with the debt of those failing nations. They were playing a game of billiards where they gave money to Greece so Greece could pay back the German banks. They were trying to delay the inevitable, hoping that strict rules and austerity could fix a problem caused by a fundamental cultural mismatch. Driving through the country with a young German woman, I saw a nation that was struggling to reconcile its desire for order with the chaos it had helped create. We drove past the former border between East and West, now just a bumpy scar on the highway. We visited the red light district where the mud wrestling used to happen. The Germans I met were polite and rule-abiding. They stopped at red lights even when no cars were coming. They were efficient and orderly. But in the world of finance, they had been the ultimate suckers. They had suppressed their own risks at home, refusing to allow a housing bubble or a credit boom in Germany, only to export their capital to the riskiest places on earth. They had ventured into the mud, believing their plastic hats would keep them dry, and now they were shocked to find themselves covered in the same mess as everyone else. Too fat to fly? It began with a strange paradox in the summer of 2011 when Standard & Poor's stripped the United States of its AAA credit rating for the first time in history. Logic dictated that the cost of borrowing for the American government should have risen, yet the exact opposite happened as Treasury yields hit record lows. The markets were signaling that even if the United States was a mess, it was the safest mess available. But the real panic has started months earlier on a Sunday evening news program when a financial analyst named Meredith Whitney predicted a wave of municipal defaults. She argued that the rot in American finance was not just at the federal level, but deep within the states and cities. Her comments set off a firestorm because she touched upon a terrifying truth that while the federal government can print money, states and cities cannot. I wanted to see where this financial stress was actually landing, so I went to California, the state that Meredith Whitney identified as the most troubling. My journey started on a bicycle in Santa Monica with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Riding with him was a physical experience of his approach to life and politics as he blew through red lights and stop signs, expecting the world to stop for him. Arnold had swept into the governor's mansion on a wave of populist anger, promising to blow up the boxes of special interests. But after 7 years, he was leaving with low approval ratings and a state budget that was more broken than when he arrived. He explained to me that the political system was rigged to maximize contempt for leadership. Every time he tried to cut spending or wrestle with public employee unions, he was stonewalled. The state solved its problems by using accounting gimmicks and simply pushing the financial burden down to the cities. To understand what happens when the burden hits the bottom, I traveled to San Jose to meet Mayor Chuck Reed. San Jose is a wealthy city, yet it was falling apart financially. Reed, a stoic man who seemed more like a sheriff than a politician, showed me the math. The problem was not just debt, but the soaring cost of public safety workers. Over the years, the police and fire unions had negotiated contracts that allowed them to retire young with massive pensions, sometimes earning more in retirement than they did while working. These pension obligations were eating the city alive. Reed called it a service default. The city would not default on its bonds to Wall Street, but instead would default on its obligations to its citizens by closing libraries and letting parks decay to pay for the retirement of public servants. The situation was even more dire in Vallejo, a city that had actually declared bankruptcy. I found a ghost town where the city hall was empty and citizens were angry. The social contract had completely broken down. The people of Vallejo looked at their police and firefighters not as protectors, but as predators who had looted the city treasury. It was a local version of what happened on Wall Street, where the people entrusted with the public good had grabbed everything they could for themselves. The city manager, Phil Batchelor, told me he was trying to run a city of over 100,000 people with a staff of 1. The bankruptcy judge had allowed the city to stiff its creditors, but the cultural damage was done. The trust was gone. I sought a deeper explanation for this collective madness from Peter Wybrow, a neuroscientist at UCLA. He offered a physiological reason for the American financial crisis. He argued that the human brain is evolved for scarcity, not abundance. We have a lizard brain that drives us to consume everything in front of us, because for most of human history, we did not know when we would eat next. In an environment of unlimited credit and material abundance, we possess no internal brakes. We are biologically ill-equipped to say no to the immediate gratification of a chocolate cake or a massive pension deal. Wybrow told me a story about a pheasant at an English estate that found a garden with no predators and unlimited food. The bird simply ate until it became so fat it could no longer fly, and eventually a fox ate it. That pheasant is us. We have gorged ourselves on cheap credit and promises we cannot keep. I finished my journey with a fire chief in Vallejo named Paige Meyer. He was a good man who just wanted to fight fires, but he was caught in a new reality where resources were scarce. He was figuring out how to keep his men fit and responsive with half the staff and broken equipment. He was adapting to the new world of scarcity. The lesson from California was clear. If we cannot find the will to regulate our own appetites, the environment will eventually step in and regulate them for us, and that process will be painful. The era of the fat pheasant is over.